This is a conversation with Francis Fukuyama, a professor and research fellow at the Stanford University and one of the most famous and influential scholars of political science and international relations of our time. Although he has decades of scholarship behind him, he is by far the most well known for one book titled The End of History and the Last Man, which is both highly influential and highly misunderstood, and in which he argued that following the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, humanity has reached the final era of human government in the form of liberal democracy. We talk about what the argument of the book really was and why is it so often misunderstood, as well as about why the end of history never happened, about why history seems to have taken a turn backwards, and why we're seeing a return of large-scale wars and conflicts and democratic backsliding, why democracies everywhere seem to be going through a major crisis and how to fix that, or what, if history isn't ending, is ahead of us now, and what, despite all of that, still gives him hope that liberal democracy is not going anywhere just yet. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon and Substack, to whom I'm deeply grateful, and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes and additional bonus content. And if you want to get more geopolitical analysis, I also write a newsletter. You can find the link for that in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
You are one of the most famous and influential political scientists in the world and of our generation, and someone who I think is fair to say has had enormous influence on how we think about democracy and its competition with other forms of governance. And I'd like to talk about all of those things. But I think before that, a good place to start would be with the fact that despite all of this, your by far, most famous work, The End of History, is quite often misunderstood, and it's often presented in a very oversimplified and perhaps incorrect way that where many people are basically understanding it as you saying back in the 90s when you wrote it, that liberal democracy has won forever and that it was the end of conflict and end of change, and that everything was sort of supposed to stay the same and just continue to get better. And I think that's not really what you meant with that. But I assume that many people listening to this don't really know the details of your work and probably only have surface level understanding of it. So maybe to start, would you explain what you actually meant and what you think people still get wrong about your thesis?
Sure. So the phrase "the end of history" was not mine. It was really a concept of the philosopher Hegel in the early 19th century. Hegel was the first historicist philosopher, meaning that he believed that human societies and human norms changed over time, basically in a progressive manner. And so for him, history was history with a capital H, which we today might label development or modernization. And to me, there's just no question that modernization is a phenomenon that's happened and it's real, it's very meaningful. And the end of history really is not the ceasing of events, it's where is modernization taking us? The most modernized societies are going to look like what? Now, Karl Marx took the concept of history from Hegel. He used it for his own purposes, and he also believed in the concept of an end of history. The Marxist end of history would be a communist society where private property had been abolished. There was a dictatorship of the proletariat. And the argument that I was making back in 1989 was that the Hegelian version, where the end of history was really a liberal state and a market economy, looked much more likely than a communist end of history. And I still believe that that is the case. The other thing that people don't recognize is that the book version of this argument was entitled The End of History and the Last Man. The last man was a phrase of Nietzsche's, who critiqued the idea of the Hegelian end of history. And he basically argued that uh, the victory of a liberal society that produced peace and prosperity would ultimately not be satisfying for many people, that people want to aspire to something higher than just living comfortable, prosperous lives, and that that would lead to instability in democracies. And so the last 5 chapters of that book were all about ways in which democracy could break down in the future. And I think that a lot of those speculations are proving to be true. I mean, they're playing out as we speak. I think that a lot of the right wing populism that you see in many countries around the world, it's very hard to understand why it's happening right now because in many ways the world is better than it ever was in terms of material prosperity, in terms of, basic political stability. But I think that there are a lot of people that don't want to be last men, that they aren't content with simple peace and prosperity, which is what liberal democracy has brought them, but they want something more. And as a result, they're turning against liberal democracy and, trying to go for something different, like, a return to some form of exclusive nationalism.
Do you ever get tired after the more than 3 decades since you came up with the thesis of how often it gets misinterpreted and how often you have to maybe correct people about what was it that you actually wrote?
Yeah, well, it's been several times a week ever since 1992. So yeah, I do get tired of it.
I want to talk about a few things that you've already hinted on about both the core argument and what you wrote about might come and how where we are today. And I think it's interesting to start on how different the world looked like back in the late 80s, early 90s when you wrote the book and how it looks like today. Because back then, liberal democracy, obviously, after the fall of the Eastern Bloc communist regimes and Soviet Union seemed to be advancing everywhere. And looking at the world today, it's kind of the opposite. There's now less democracies, fewer democracies than there was previously. Autocratic powers are on the rise. How much of that, what the trajectory, how surprising was that to you?
Um, well, since I had speculated at some length about the ways in which democracy could break down, it's not a complete surprise that a lot of that is being borne out today. The thing that is the most surprising, though, is what's happened in the United States, because I really did not think that American voters would, uh, elect somebody like Donald Trump and not just elect him once, but elect him twice, even after he had tried to overturn the 2020 election. I thought that Americans were much more committed to liberal democracy than that vote indicated. And so that's been a huge disappointment. And it's also very serious for the rest of the world because when the United States begins acting like an authoritarian power, that gives permission to every other country to, backslide from good democratic practice and the rule of law.
Isn't Donald Trump kind of a doesn't his rise as a president sort of symbolize what you wrote in the second part of the book or by the end in the final chapters of the book as the revolt of people against the stability and maybe against just living in peace and having too good? Isn't he the disruptor that you spoke about might come?
Yeah, I think that's true. If you listen to him, he says that things have never been worse. That the United States is being destroyed from within. The country is not recognizable anymore. all of these are just absurd assertions. The United States is peaceful, it's prosperous. It's one thing in the 1930s when Germany had suffered defeat in the First World War, then hyperinflation, then economic collapse. In a way, you can understand the rise of fascism under those circumstances because they went through a very, very extreme set of traumas. But the United States has not done that. It's we've had the COVID epidemic, we've had a mild case of inflation, but compared to the historical disruptions that the United States itself has experienced, it's nothing. I mean, we're actually living in one of the best imaginable times. If you look back at the Great Depression in the early 1930s, the unemployment rate in the United States was over 20%. You had millions and millions of people out of work, and a general world order that was very much disrupted with the rise of communism and fascism. And yet, the American people at that point did not vote like the German people or the Italian people for a dictator. They voted for Franklin Roosevelt, and they stayed well within the bounds of a recognizable democracy. But this time around, under much more benign circumstances, we're getting Donald Trump, and I think the only explanation for that is something like this: what I had talked about, boredom at the end of history. That people just don't like the prospect of uh, continuing peace and prosperity. They want to struggle. They want to pretend that they're fighting for something higher, and that has proved to be very disruptive for American democracy.
I guess another thing that comes to mind that we have now, but we didn't have before, is the way that information is circulated in society. And obviously, the way now information works and how easily you can reach people through social media. Do you think that is playing some kind of a significant role, or is that just maybe um, an additional factor, but not the key one?
Well, I actually wrote a piece about this recently on my blog called "It's the Internet, Stupid." I think that there have been all sorts of explanations given for the rise of populism at this particular moment. But I think the one that is probably the most persuasive is actually the internet and social media, because it really has taken away the kinds of controls that existed over information. Previously there had been certain uh, intermediaries that could vouch for the credibility of basic factual information. These are traditional media companies, newspapers, television, and the like. There was obviously a lot of distortion and bias and whatnot, but you know they weren't broadcasting just outright lies. The internet has permitted anybody to say anything and to get really big audiences to listen to them. And that's exactly what's happened. And so you got this very weird phenomenon of the anti vaccine movement where, vaccines have been one of the great miracles of, the past century. And yet you've got millions of people that somehow think that they're actually dangerous and, have stopped taking them. So I don't think that that kind of thing could have happened without the internet and without social media.
Do you think that this kind of era of craziness is sort of, when it comes to internet and social media, is kind of a temporary thing where we will eventually learn how to exist with this type of technology? Or is it more of a permanent change and it's just going to get crazier and crazier?
Yeah, well, you haven't even mentioned artificial intelligence yet, which is actually going to be probably even more effective in destroying the credibility of a lot of existing information sources. Yeah, I can't answer that question. I think that every other wave of technological disruption eventually was overcome, and people learned how to regulate it and adapt to it. And I suspect that that's going to happen in this case. If it doesn't, I think modern democracy is in a lot of trouble. There are other potential technological disruptions. I published a book in, I think it was 2001, called Our Post-Human Future, where I talked about biotechnology. And I argued that if you have a technology that's actually capable of altering human nature, that that is going to have huge political implications for our understanding of human rights and what a human being is. And that's a revolution that hasn't really even begun to unfold yet.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about the major threat that Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, is facing, why he's increasingly likely to be defeated in the next year's elections, why his new challenger is not at all who you would expect, and why it might be a lesson for politicians everywhere. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. And going back to Trump, do you see him as more of a temporary aberration, as something that happened by a crazy mix of coincidences, and that when his term finishes, things will sort of go back to the way they were before? Or do you see him as someone, maybe with the movement that he's going to leave behind, who has and will kind of change America forever? And I guess, in what way would that change look like?
Well, I think that he is a uniquely talented politician, and it is going to be very hard to undo what he has created. He's created a movement. And actually, one of the most depressing things is to see how many followers he has recruited and how many normally intelligent people are willing to help him and, repeat his ridiculous arguments, about vaccines, about the election, so forth. And so we're going to be stuck with a uh, right wing movement for some time to come. Whether that is a permanent change in our politics is hard to say. I do think that you're already seeing a reaction. We had an election last week in which the Democrats, the opposition, did extraordinarily well. If they win the control of the House of Representatives next November, that will put a serious damper on Trump's ability to do things. Um, actually, quite frankly, the thing I worry about right now is whether we actually can have a free and fair election in the United States, because Trump already demonstrated that he is willing to overturn an election, and he may try to do it again. So we'll have to see. But assuming that we actually do have an election that constitutes a setback to Trump, there's a path forward where we may be able to get past the worst of this kind of populism.
Is that everything we're talking about kind of changing how you thought about all of this back then when you wrote The End of History?
Well, look, there's a lot of things I've changed my mind about. I wrote this 2-volume series, The Origins of Political Order, and then the second volume, Political Order and Political Decay. And that was really an attempt to rewrite the end of history, based on what I understand now about the evolution of human politics. And there's several uh, major revisions that were already contained in those excuse me, those 2 volumes. The most important, in a way, was my recognition of the importance of having a modern impersonal state. That's something I didn't really appreciate when I wrote The End of History back in 1991. And the other was the concept of political decay, where history is not simply forward progress; it can also go backwards. And I think right now we're in the midst of a big regression in democratic institutions. So I've modified my views in a lot of different ways, since that time.
Would you still agree with the sort of a main thesis is that the irreplaceability or inevitability of liberal democracy as maybe not the final stage that never changes, but still the system that we haven't come up with a better alternative, and people will sort of head in that trajectory nevertheless.
Well, first of all, I never argued that liberal democracy was inevitable. Um, the question really was a much more modest one. Is there a systematic alternative to liberal democracy and a market economy that looked like it was going to be more successful, more stable, more satisfying for people to live under? And on that question, I don't really see a an alternative. The country that came closest or comes closest is really China, which has an authoritarian political system and a semi-market economy, and it's been very impressive. The degree to which they've consolidated that regime. Uh, is it going to be an alternative that people will be turning to in the future? That I'm less certain about because I'm not sure that you can replicate the Chinese model in most other countries. Uh, but I think that's still an open question. The one the one issue that I think probably needed the most serious revision was modernization theory, because at the time I wrote The End of History and The Last Man, I believed in some version of modernization theory that said that along with economic development and the growth of a modern industrial than an information economy, that there would be greater political incentives to move towards a more liberal form of political organization. And, at the time, there were several cases of this. Taiwan, Japan, Korea had all industrialized and they had all made a transition to pretty successful liberal democracies. But I think now, China has surpassed those countries in terms of per capita income. And if modernization were simply true, they should have democratized or at least liberalized a long time ago, and they haven't. And so, the view that economic development past a certain point would promote a different kind of liberal political uh, structure, I think, has proven not to be true.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that the reasons why we thought previously that this would happen have turned out to actually not be the reality?
Well, there's a lot of things. I mean, democracy, is rests on a number of things going on in society other than the level of economic development, including, people's past experiences of alternative forms. And I think that in China, given the instability throughout most of the 20th century, people were actually looking towards a more authoritarian form of government. The other thing is also cultural, that China, this is what I wrote about in my political order books. China has been doing centralized government for several millennia. Although you can democratize a Chinese society, as happened in Taiwan and was happening in Hong Kong, there's a very deep cultural tradition of obedience to centralized authority. And I think you've seen that, as one of the supports for the Chinese Communist Party in recent years.
I do, on that note, I do have to say that I had a chance to study with several Chinese students in Western universities, and in every single case, they have seen democracy as a Western concept rather than something that would be universal, and one that just isn't suitable for China. Which I'm not saying it's true, but it was interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean it's a reflection of the time also, because I think 20, 30 years ago a lot of those same students would have said, yes, Western democracy is a model that we want to follow, but Western democracy hasn't been looking very good lately. So it's not surprising that they are reverting now to, older traditions.
Well, talking about China, I think in general, in the 90s, the ratio of democracies and autocracies was definitely going in favor of democracies. And now it has shifted, and we're having more autocracies and fewer democracies. Do you think that maybe in the 90s, in the euphoria, we have kind of underestimated how resilient autocracies and these types of regimes can be?
Yeah, I think that it's not just the resilience of the regimes. I think there's some underlying social factors that have led to that result. Yeah, I mean, look, democracy has come in waves. The third wave began in the early 70s with Spain and Portugal, and it crested around the time of the global financial crisis in 2008. But, you've had the first and second waves previously, and so there was never a linear movement towards democracy. So the real question is, are we going to see some kind of permanent regression? Or is this, another wave that's going to be followed by another wave of, pro-democratic movement? And, we simply don't know at the moment.
Do you have a theory?
No, I don't have a theory.
Do you have a personal guess?
Uh, well, I think that there's some real downsides to authoritarian government. First of all, economic. I think the Chinese have made their economy work, but that's based on adoption of a lot of liberal market principles. And they've also made some really big mistakes in terms of state intervention in their economy. Um, and there's also real problems with an authoritarian decision making system. At certain times, it can be very effective because you need to respond to an emergency, or you need to make certain very fundamental changes in your political system. It's easier to do that if you're an authoritarian government than a democracy. On the other hand, democracies do have an ability to correct themselves. And, we may see a big correction in the way that the United States is governed. I mean, it's true, I think, that American government was not by any means uh, efficient and effective, before the rise of Donald Trump. And so there are still things that need to be fixed about the way our system operates. And I think, at least in a true liberal democracy, you have more opportunities to make those adjustments than under an authoritarian regime.
I think that's definitely a really good observation about how a lot of Western democracies are kind of losing their appeal because they're not really seen as that effective systems. And it does seem quite objective that a lot of Western democracies kind of struggle with the governance that maybe previously they were a lot better at. Why do you think that this is? Why does the system, it seems like if the plumbing was kind of getting worse over time, why do you think that is? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.